I'm Dr. Sarah Collins, a general surgeon at Green Valley Hospital, a bustling urban medical center nestled in the heart of the city. For over 15 years, I've stood in the operating room, scalpel in hand, navigating the fine line between life and death. Green Valley serves a vast, diverse population, immigrants, working-class families, people from all walks of life, each bringing unique stories and urgent medical needs. The emergency room is often a whirlwind of chaos, with trauma cases flooding in at all hours. In this environment, speed and precision aren't just virtues, they're necessities. Over the course of my career, I've performed more than 2,500 surgeries, from routine appendectomies to complex trauma repairs. My colleagues have often described me as calm under pressure, a surgeon who doesn't flinch when the stakes are highest. Yet, no matter how many procedures I've completed or how many lives I've saved, there's one case that still haunts me. It's a story that doesn't fit neatly into the textbooks or clinical guidelines I've relied on throughout my training. A case that challenged my understanding of medicine and of life itself in ways I never anticipated. Green Valley Hospital is always humming with activity. The emergency department is a revolving door where ambulances arrive with sirens wailing and nurses scramble to triage the injured. Our trauma surgeons, myself included, are often running at full throttle, juggling multiple cases simultaneously. The hospital's resources are stretched thin, but we make it work. We've become a well-oiled machine, a team trained to respond instantly to the unpredictable nature of emergencies. In this environment, there's little room for doubt or hesitation. Decisions have to be made quickly, often with incomplete information. We rely on protocols honed by years of practice and evidence-based medicine. I remember the day the case came in as vividly as if it were yesterday. It was a late afternoon when the trauma team was alerted to a multiple vehicle collision on the highway. The ambulance crew radioed in that a young woman had sustained severe injuries, and the paramedics were performing CPR en route. I prepared the trauma bay, alerting my team and reviewing the protocols for massive abdominal trauma. The patient's name was Emily R., a 29-year-old woman with no significant medical history. The paramedics reported unstable vital signs and suspected internal bleeding. Her condition was critical. When Emily arrived, it was clear from the outset that this was a high-stakes emergency. She was unconscious, pale, and her blood pressure was dangerously low. The monitor showed arrhythmias intermittently, and her pulse was weak. The emergency department staff worked swiftly to establish 4 lines and begin transfusions, but the severity of her injuries necessitated immediate surgery. I scrubbed in quickly, mentally preparing for what I knew would be a challenging operation. Operating in the trauma bay is unlike a scheduled surgery. There's no time for detailed imaging or exhaustive lab work. The damage is often extensive and unpredictable. Emily had suffered multiple fractures and blunt abdominal trauma. The initial assessment suggested that her liver and spleen might be lacerated, causing massive hemorrhage. Controlling the bleeding was paramount. As I entered the operating room, I could feel the weight of responsibility settle heavily on my shoulders. The trauma team was ready, anesthesiologists, nurses, surgical assistants, all synchronized in their roles. The surgery itself was a blur of controlled urgency. I made a rapid midline incision and was immediately confronted with a chaotic scene inside her abdomen. Blood pooled in the peritoneal cavity, and several organs showed signs of trauma. The spleen was shattered beyond repair, and the liver had deep lacerations. I moved swiftly to clamp bleeding vessels, applying pressure and packing the abdomen carefully to stem the flow. The anesthesiologist kept me updated on her vitals, which fluctuated dangerously. I worked methodically, balancing speed with precision. The surgical team communicated seamlessly, anticipating each move and handing instruments without a word. Despite our efforts, Emily's condition remained precarious. Her heart rate was erratic, and her oxygen saturation dipped intermittently. The blood products we administered stabilized her blood pressure for brief moments, but then it would fall again. Time was slipping away. After 2 intense hours, I managed to control the bleeding sufficiently to close the abdomen temporarily. The hope was that with ongoing resuscitation in the ICU, her body would recover. But the hours that followed were grim. Emily's vital signs deteriorated rapidly overnight. She went into cardiac arrest twice, prompting CPR and advanced life support attempts. Each time we managed to restore a faint pulse, but the damage from blood loss and shock was profound. At 3:42 a.m., after exhausting all interventions, the attending physician declared her clinically dead. The room fell silent. The trauma team was drained, and I felt a heavy knot of grief and frustration tighten in my chest. Delivering the news to Emily's family was one of the hardest moments of my career. Her parents and younger brother had arrived at the hospital, hoping for good news. The weight of their grief was palpable. I sat with them, explaining the severity of her injuries and the efforts we had made. Tears flowed freely, and I struggled to find words that could offer any comfort. Felt like the end of a long, painful fight. But then, something happened that defied explanation. Approximately 10 minutes after Emily was pronounced dead, the nurse called out urgently from the adjacent room. The cardiac monitor, which had gone flat, suddenly showed a faint but consistent heartbeat. We rushed to her bedside, disbelief washing over the team. Emily's chest was rising and falling slowly. Her pupils reacted to light. The monitor beeped steadily, confirming cardiac activity. It was as if she had returned from the brink of death itself. We immediately resumed resuscitative measures, oxygen, and supportive care, fearing this might be a transient event. But as the minutes passed, it became clear that this was no brief flicker. Emily's vital signs stabilized, though she remained unconscious. The ICU team prepared for her transfer, and I stayed by her side, grappling with the surreal nature of what had occurred. How could someone declared dead simply come back like that? Was it a malfunction of the equipment? A rare physiological anomaly? I was left with more questions than answers. The medical literature I reviewed later had sparse references to spontaneous return of circulation, but such cases were exceedingly rare and poorly understood. Some called it Lazarus phenomenon, but there was little consensus on mechanisms or implications. I kept returning to that night, haunted by the image of Emily's sudden revival. It challenged everything I thought I knew about death and the finality we place on it in medicine. In the weeks that followed, I found myself unable to let go of the case. I revisited Emily's medical records repeatedly, sought out colleagues for their perspectives, and scoured research papers in search of explanations. The hospital staff were divided. Some dismissed it as a fluke or an error. Others were intrigued but hesitant to speak openly. For me, it planted a seed of doubt about the certainty of our protocols and the limits of our knowledge. The case of Emily R. has stayed with me through every surgery since. It was a moment where the boundaries between life and death blurred. A reminder that medicine, for all its advances, still holds mysteries beyond our grasp. And as a surgeon accustomed to controlling outcomes with precision, that uncertainty has been both unsettling and profoundly humbling. Emily R.'s case was the kind of medical emergency that no surgeon ever forgets, not just because of the injuries but because of the bewildering sequence of events that followed. After her spontaneous return to life in the trauma bay, the days that ensued were a blur of critical care, neurologic assessments, and relentless monitoring. Despite the odds, Emily began to stabilize, though her future remained uncertain. It was 2 days after her admission when I was called to the ICU for a follow-up evaluation. Emily lay in a dimly lit room, surrounded by monitors and machines that beeped rhythmically. Her eyes were closed, her breathing steady but assisted by a ventilator. I reviewed her scans and lab results with the intensivist. The hepatic lacerations had begun healing, and there was no sign of intracranial hemorrhage on her CT scans. Still, her neurological status was ambiguous. She remained unresponsive, and the medical team was cautiously optimistic but wary. As I stood by her bedside, I recalled the surreal moment when she had defied every expectation by reviving after being declared dead. It unsettled me, stirring a mixture of hope and confusion. How could her brain survive the period of no circulation? Was there some unknown protective mechanism at work? These questions gnawed at me as I prepared to perform neurological assessments. I checked her pupillary reflexes, motor responses, and cranial nerve function. To my surprise, There were subtle signs of responsiveness. Slight finger movements, purposeful eye blinks when spoken to. It was a fragile thread of consciousness amid profound trauma. The medical team maintained supportive care, and over the next week, Emily's responsiveness gradually improved. She began to open her eyes more frequently and even followed simple commands. Physical therapy was initiated cautiously, as her muscles had weakened from immobility. It was a slow, painstaking process, but it felt like a medical miracle unfolding before us. Yet, the emotional intensity of the situation weighed heavily on everyone involved. Emily's family remained hopeful but also fearful of the uncertain road ahead. I spent hours with them, discussing prognosis, potential complications, and treatment plans. Their gratitude for her unexpected survival was tempered by the anxiety of not knowing what the future held. I shared their hope but also my professional caution. Trauma survivors often face complex recoveries, and neurologic outcomes can be unpredictable. Throughout this period, the hospital buzzed with whispers about Emily's case. Colleagues debated the nature of her revival, and some questioned the accuracy of the death declaration. Was it premature, or was this truly a spontaneous return of life? These conversations permeated surgical meetings and staff lounges, instilling a mix of skepticism and curiosity. One afternoon, a week after Emily's admission, I was called back to the ICU. The nurse reported that Emily's vital signs had suddenly deteriorated. Her heart rate was erratic, blood pressure unstable, and oxygen saturation dropping. Despite all the progress, her condition was now critical again. I hurried to the bedside, joined by the critical care team. We initiated emergency interventions to stabilize her, but the situation deteriorated rapidly. Within minutes, Emily suffered a cardiac arrest. We launched into resuscitation protocols immediately: chest compressions, intubation, administration of epinephrine. The room was tense, every second stretching unbearably long. After nearly 20 minutes of advanced cardiac life support, the team determined that all efforts had failed. Emily was pronounced clinically dead once more. The sense of loss was palpable, a stark contrast to the fragile hope we had nurtured. But then, as bewildering as before, the monitors began to show faint electrical activity. The cardiac rhythm shifted from asystole to a slow, irregular heartbeat. The nurse called out in disbelief, and we all rushed to her side. Emily's chest rose and fell again, faint but unmistakable signs of life. It was another spontaneous return from the brink, a second resurrection that defied medical explanation. This time, the emotional impact was even more intense. The staff oscillated between relief and disbelief, grappling with the surreal nature of Emily's condition. Was this a miracle, a fluke, or evidence of something our medical understanding missed? The event sparked intense discussions among the attending physicians, nurses, and specialists. Some suggested that delayed pharmacologic effects or residual circulation might explain the phenomenon, while others wondered about rare physiologic responses. For me, it was deeply personal. I had been the surgeon who declared Emily dead twice, only to witness her come back each time. The experience challenged my confidence and forced me to confront the limitations of our protocols. The notion of death, which I had always regarded as definitive, now seemed mutable, fragile. In the days that followed, Emily's condition stabilized again, but with continued uncertainty. Her neurological status remained unclear. She showed intermittent signs of awareness, but was far from fully recovered. The rehabilitation team began working with her to regain motor function, speech, and cognition, but progress was slow and unpredictable. Outside the ICU, Emily's story began to attract attention beyond the hospital walls. News of her multiple resuscitations sparked conversations in community forums and online groups. Some hailed it as a medical miracle, others as a sign of hope for trauma survivors. For me, it was a case study in the profound mysteries of human physiology and resilience. Amid the clinical bustle, I found myself increasingly consumed by Emily's case. I pored over medical literature on spontaneous return of circulation, known in some circles as Lazarus syndrome, where patients reportedly revive after failed resuscitation attempts. The literature was sparse and mostly anecdotal, with no clear consensus on mechanisms or implications. I consulted with neurologists, cardiologists, and intensivists, seeking insights that could explain Emily's unusual trajectory. The more I learned, the more I realized how little we understood about these phenomena. The medical community largely accepted death declarations as final, guided by established protocols and diagnostic criteria. Yet, Emily's case, and the few others documented, suggested that the boundary between life and death might be more porous than assumed. This realization unsettled me deeply. As a surgeon, my role was to save lives, but also to recognize when efforts were futile. The finality of death was a cornerstone of medical decision-making, influencing care plans, family discussions, and ethical considerations. To question that finality was to question the foundation of my profession. Despite the doubts and questions, I remained committed to Emily's care. Each day brought new challenges and small victories. Her medical team worked tirelessly to support her recovery, navigating the complexities of trauma, critical care, and rehabilitation. I visited her frequently, watching her progress with cautious hope. Emily's case became a turning point in my career, a moment when the predictable certainties of surgery and medicine gave way to profound mystery. It was a reminder that the human body, even when battered and broken, holds secrets we have yet to unravel. And it was a call to remain humble in the face of the unknown, to recognize that even in the most clinical of settings, life can surprise us in ways we cannot always explain. The case of Emily became an obsession for me. Couldn't let it go, no matter how hard I tried. Her spontaneous revival after being declared dead challenged everything I believed about the finality of death, and it gnawed at my professional certainty. I found myself revisiting every detail, searching for a rational explanation that would fit within the framework of medical science I had devoted my life to. I began by combing through the medical literature on spontaneous return of circulation and near-death phenomena. The term Lazarus syndrome surfaced repeatedly, named after the biblical figure who was raised from the dead. Reports were scarce, often anecdotal, and lacked comprehensive scientific explanation. Some papers suggested that delayed return of cardiac activity might result from factors like residual drug effects, hyperinflation of the lungs during resuscitation, or delayed venous return. But none of these theories fully accounted for Emily's case, especially given the complexity and severity of her trauma. Driven by a need to understand, I spent hours after shifts reviewing peer-reviewed journals, case reports, and even historical accounts of similar events. I reached out to colleagues in cardiology, neurology, and critical care, seeking their perspectives. Some were intrigued, others skeptical. A few dismissed such occurrences as statistical anomalies or errors in monitoring. Yet, the more I dug, the more I realized that these rare cases might be the tip of an iceberg we had barely begun to explore. Within Green Valley Hospital, my fixation on Emily's case began to ripple through the medical staff. Some colleagues felt uneasy about my insistence on revisiting a case they considered closed. "We do everything by the book," one senior surgeon told me. "You can't change the protocols based on one unusual patient." Others, however, were curious. Nurses who had been on duty that night approached me with questions, recounting subtle signs they'd noticed but dismissed as inconsequential. A few residents asked if they could review Emily's charts for their own research. The hospital was abuzz with a mix of skepticism and fascination. But the institutional response was cautious. Hospital administration emphasized adherence to existing guidelines for death declaration and resuscitation. They reminded me that protocols were developed to provide clarity and consistency in high-pressure situations. Challenging these protocols risked confusion and could undermine trust in the medical system. I understood their position, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were missing something fundamental. The internal conflict grew. I struggled to reconcile the rigidity of medical protocols with the fluidity of what I had witnessed firsthand. Death, as defined by clinical criteria, lack of pulse, absence of spontaneous breathing, fixed pupils, seemed less absolute. The human body's capacity for recovery appeared more resilient and mysterious than textbooks acknowledged. It was a humbling realization, but also a deeply unsettling one. My fixation started to affect my work. Colleagues noticed that I was distracted during rounds, that I hesitated before making decisions that once came instinctively. The operating room, which had always been a place where I thrived, now felt fraught with uncertainty. Could I trust my assessments? Was it possible that some patients I had declared beyond help might have had another chance if we had waited longer or altered our approach? One evening, after a long day in the OR, I sat alone in the hospital library, reviewing Emily's case notes once more. I wondered how many other patients might have experienced similar spontaneous recoveries but gone unnoticed or undocumented. Were we simply unaware, or worse, dismissive of these rare events? The thought was unsettling. It suggested that our understanding of death, and by extension, the decisions we make about it, might be incomplete. I began to document Emily's case meticulously, compiling timelines, physiological data, and treatment notes. I reached out to researchers who had published on Lazarus syndrome, hoping to contribute to a broader understanding. Some responded with interest, sharing their own experiences and observations. Others cautioned against drawing conclusions from isolated cases, warning me about the dangers of confirmation bias and anecdotal evidence. Despite the mixed reception, I pressed on. I convened informal meetings with colleagues from emergency medicine, neurology, and critical care to discuss the phenomenon. These gatherings were fraught with tension. Some doctors viewed my inquiries as academic curiosity, while others perceived them as a challenge to their clinical judgment. The debates were intense but necessary, pushing us to question assumptions and explore new avenues. Among the nursing staff, reactions varied. Some nurses expressed a quiet skepticism, concerned about the implications for end-of-life care and the emotional toll on families. Others were intrigued by the mystery, sharing stories of patients who had come back under unusual circumstances. The hospital's social workers and chaplains also became involved, reflecting on the intersection of medicine, spirituality, and the human experience of death and dying. As weeks turned into months, my professional relationships began to feel strained. Some colleagues distanced themselves, wary of being associated with what they saw as an unorthodox pursuit. Others offered quiet support but warned about the potential impact on my reputation. It was a lonely path, but I believed it was necessary. Medicine must evolve, and that evolution requires questioning even the most fundamental beliefs. In the midst of this, the hospital administration reminded me of the importance of focusing on patient care and following established protocols. They acknowledged the uniqueness of Emily's case but emphasized that policy changes required robust evidence, not isolated anecdotes. I agreed on the need for evidence but felt compelled to keep investigating. I also grappled with the ethical dimensions of these phenomena. If patients could spontaneously regain circulation after being declared dead, how long should we continue resuscitative efforts? How do we balance the risk of futile interventions against the possibility of unexpected recovery? These questions had profound implications for end-of-life care, resource allocation, and family counseling. The more I explored, the more I realized that the intersection of medicine and the mysteries of human physiology was a frontier still largely uncharted. Emily's case was not just a clinical puzzle. It was a catalyst for broader reflection on the limits of knowledge and the humility required in the practice of medicine. In quieter moments, I found myself pondering the meaning of these events beyond the clinical setting. Could there be aspects of consciousness and life that transcend our current understanding? Was there a biological basis for what we witnessed, or did it touch on realms beyond science? These questions were deeply personal, stirring a sense of awe and unease. As I continued to care for Emily and review similar cases, I became increasingly aware that medicine is as much an art as a science, a delicate balance between empirical knowledge and the acceptance of mystery. My journey into this phenomenon was far from over, and the questions it raised would continue to shape my career and my understanding of what it means to live and to die. As my investigation into Emily's case deepened, I began uncovering other patients who, like her, had experienced unexplained resuscitations after being declared dead. These discoveries were both fascinating and disturbing, further challenging the medical certainties I had long relied upon. One of the first was Mark H., a 54-year-old man admitted after a severe myocardial infarction. He had been in cardiac arrest for nearly 20 minutes before paramedics restored a pulse en route to the hospital. Despite aggressive interventions, Mark's condition deteriorated, and after a prolonged resuscitation attempt in the ICU, he was declared deceased. His family was notified, and preparations for organ donation were underway when, astonishingly, the cardiac monitor registered a faint but steady heartbeat. The ICU staff rushed to respond, and Mark gradually regained spontaneous circulation. Mark's recovery was slow and complicated, but he emerged with surprisingly intact neurological function. Reviewing his chart revealed no clear physiological explanation for this spontaneous return of circulation. The incident was documented in the hospital's morbidity and mortality records, but dismissed by some as an anomaly or equipment error. For me, it was another piece in a growing puzzle. Lisa T., a 42-year-old woman, was another case that troubled me deeply. She had been admitted following a drug overdose leading to respiratory failure and cardiac arrest. After prolonged resuscitation with no signs of improvement, she was pronounced dead. Hours later, during routine postmortem care, a nurse noticed spontaneous breathing efforts. Lisa was swiftly transferred back to critical care, where she made a remarkable recovery with no significant neurological deficits. These additional cases forced me to confront uncomfortable questions about the reliability of established death protocols. How could patients declared dead show spontaneous signs of life? Were we, as a medical community, adequately equipped to identify the precise moment of death? The physiological mechanisms behind these recoveries remained elusive, and the existing literature offered little guidance. I began to compile these cases systematically, seeking patterns and commonalities. Each patient had endured a period of apparent clinical death, followed by spontaneous return of circulation and, notably, intact neurological function. The phenomenon was not isolated to trauma or cardiac arrest alone, but spanned diverse clinical scenarios. As I raised these concerns with colleagues and hospital leadership, I encountered resistance. Many regarded these cases as curiosities rather than a call to reevaluate protocols. Some questioned the validity of the death declarations, suggesting premature pronouncements or misinterpretations of vital signs. Others worried about the potential implications for medical practice and resource allocation. The strain on my professional relationships grew palpable. Some peers viewed my insistence on investigating these phenomena as disruptive, while others offered tentative support. I sensed a growing divide between those comfortable with the established medical framework and those willing to entertain the possibility that our understanding of death was incomplete. My reputation became a subject of quiet discussion. I was sometimes seen as overly cautious or even obsessive. Yet, I could not ignore the ethical weight of these cases. The possibility that patients might be prematurely declared dead carried profound implications for patient care, family communication, and medical decision-making. These tensions extended beyond the clinical realm. Hospital administrators emphasized adherence to standardized protocols to maintain consistency and legal protection. They acknowledged the uniqueness of these cases but urged caution in interpreting their significance. I understood their position but felt compelled to advocate for deeper inquiry. The emotional toll was significant. I found myself questioning not only medical practice but also my own judgment. Had I, or we as a profession, overlooked signs that could have saved lives? Was there a need to revise training, protocols, or observation periods before declaring death? These questions haunted me during sleepless nights and quiet moments. Amid this professional turbulence, I continued to care for patients with renewed vigilance. Each death declaration became a moment of heightened scrutiny. I advocated for extended observation and multidisciplinary consultation in borderline cases. The ICU protocols began to reflect a cautious approach, influenced in part by the cases I highlighted. Yet, the medical community at large remained hesitant. The rarity of these phenomena made it difficult to justify widespread changes based on anecdotal evidence. The risk of prolonging futile interventions and the emotional burden on families had to be balanced against the possibility of unexpected recovery. I also grappled with the psychological impact on families who had experienced these events. The roller coaster of grief, hope, and confusion was profound. Supporting them required sensitivity and clear communication, often navigating uncharted emotional territory. These experiences deepened my appreciation for the complexity of end-of-life care. Death is not merely a clinical event but a deeply human experience, intertwined with hope, despair, and the limits of our knowledge. The cases of Emily, Mark, and Lisa served as stark reminders that the boundary between life and death might be more fluid than we acknowledge. As I continued to document and analyze these cases, I became increasingly aware of the need for broader research and discussion. Medical conferences, journals, and ethics committees were potential platforms for raising awareness. But I also recognized the challenges: skepticism, institutional inertia, and the discomfort of confronting uncertainty. My commitment to this inquiry began to shape my professional identity. I found myself drawn toward critical care and palliative medicine, fields where the nuances of life, death, and quality of life intersect profoundly. The surgical world, with its focus on definitive action, started to feel constraining in light of these complex realities. The strain in my surgical practice grew. I questioned whether I could continue to operate with the same confidence, knowing the finality of death might not be as absolute as I once believed. The burden of these uncertainties weighed heavily on me, influencing my decisions and interactions. Despite the challenges, I remained determined to pursue understanding. The cases of Emily, Mark, and Lisa were not isolated anomalies but windows into a phenomenon demanding attention. Their recoveries challenged the binary view of life and death and underscored the need for humility in medicine. I began to envision a future where protocols might incorporate longer observation periods, improved monitoring technologies, and interdisciplinary evaluations before declaring death. Such changes would require evidence, advocacy, and a willingness to embrace medical uncertainty. As I reflected on these experiences, I understood that my journey was part of a larger narrative, the ongoing evolution of medicine in the face of human complexity. The mysteries of life and death remain profound, resisting easy answers. And in that space of uncertainty lies both the challenge and the hope of medical practice. After years of grappling with the unsettling cases that challenged the finality of death, I reached a crossroads in my career. The weight of uncertainty, the professional isolation, and the ethical quandaries had taken their toll. I realized I needed space, distance from the high-stakes environment of the operating room, to reflect deeply and pursue a path more aligned with the questions that now occupied my mind. I decided to take a sabbatical from surgery. Leaving behind the predictable rhythms of the OR was difficult but necessary. I moved to a quieter town, away from the hectic pace of Green Valley Hospital, where I could focus on research in critical care and human physiology. The goal was to understand better the enigmatic phenomena I had witnessed, the spontaneous returns of circulation, the fragile boundary between life and death. In this new chapter, I began working in palliative care, a field centered on patient quality of life and ethical considerations at the end of life. The shift was profound. Instead of rushing to intervene, I now spent time listening, comforting, and guiding patients and families through the most vulnerable moments of existence. This work deepened my appreciation for the complexity of dying, not just as a biological event but as a deeply personal, social, and spiritual experience. The cases of Emily, Mark, and Lisa continued to haunt me. Their unexpected recoveries were a constant reminder that death is not always absolute. These experiences reshaped my understanding of medicine, urging me to approach life and death with humility rather than certainty. I found myself drawn to the mysteries that traditional medical training often leaves unexplored: the nuances of consciousness, the interplay between physiology and perception, and the elusive nature of human existence. I dedicated myself to studying these phenomena, collaborating with researchers in neurology, cardiology, and bioethics. We examined patient records, physiological data, and emerging research on near-death experiences and spontaneous return of circulation. The scientific community remained cautious but increasingly curious. Slowly, conversations began to shift from skepticism to genuine inquiry. In the quiet hours of my new practice, I often reflected on the implications of these cases. How many patients might have returned if we had simply waited longer or observed more carefully? How do we define death in a way that honors both scientific rigor and the profound mysteries of life? These questions do not have easy answers, but pondering them has become central to my work and my philosophy of care. My relationship with medicine transformed. I no longer saw it solely as a field of technical mastery, but as a discipline that must embrace uncertainty and compassion. The operating room's clear-cut outcomes gave way to the nuanced realities of human biology and experience. I found peace in this complexity, even as it challenged my previous certainties. As I continue this journey, I remain committed to raising awareness about the limits of our current understanding of death. I advocate for research, education, and protocol revisions that reflect the possibility of spontaneous recovery. It is a delicate balance, honoring the dignity of patients, supporting families, and recognizing the boundaries of medical knowledge. The mystery of human existence remains profoundly elusive. The dead do not always stay dead, and consciousness might persist beyond what we can measure. These revelations have reshaped my career and my life. I am no longer the surgeon who declared death with unwavering certainty. Instead, I am a physician who understands that life and death are intertwined in ways we have yet to fully comprehend. In this space between life and death, I have found a deeper sense of purpose. My work now centers on compassion, inquiry, and the acceptance that medicine must often dwell in uncertainty. The cases that once shook my confidence now inspire me to seek knowledge with humility and to care for patients with renewed empathy. Though questions remain unanswered, I embrace the mystery. It is a reminder that medicine is not just about prolonging life or avoiding death, but about honoring the profound journey between the two. As I move forward, I carry the lessons of Emily, Mark, and Lisa with me. Patients who challenged the finality of death and expanded the horizons of human possibility. Their stories continue to guide me, compelling me to look beyond protocols and statistics and to see the fragile, resilient essence of life itself.